Second.
All right, great. I'm just going to wait here just for a quick second.
There we go. Mine's live at least now.
All right, perfect. Well, we're super happy to be here, Dr. Amols and myself, on this fourth episode of Egg Meets Sperm. And today we're taking a topic that has really boomed in the last 10 years, and that's egg freezing. And this is really a very interesting topic in our world because in 2011, it was still considered to be experimental, and that's when the kind of the label on it switched to being ready for real time use. And egg freezing has been used for a whole host of reasons. In the past, it was used so that some people didn't want to fertilize all the eggs right away to create embryos. So they would only fertilize some of the eggs and keep others frozen as eggs. It's also been used for cancer patients who are going to go through treatment that may potentially harm their fertility. And so they would freeze eggs with the hopes that they could use those eggs in the future if they needed to use them. And then, of course, kind of, I would say the most prevalent use of egg freezing and the most contemporary thing that we're doing and seeing a lot of is that, women and individuals are choosing to freeze their eggs so that in the future, if they experience some issues around infertility, they could go back and kind of mine those eggs that were frozen at a younger age, and presumably those are going to be higher quality eggs to then use for IVF and then to have a baby. But that's a very kind of high level, view of egg freezing. And I think maybe where I'd love to start this, Dr. Amos, is a little bit of historical perspective. So we've been around the block a little bit, but we're also haven't been doing IVF since 1978 when Louise Brown was born. And how have you seen egg freezing evolve over your career since your training to now?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said best earlier when you were talking about how it's new now with regards to the fact that we are doing it for patients for their own, preservation for the future. Back in the past when I started, I mean, it was experimental. Even when the experimental phrase was taken off it by American Society of Reproductive Medicine, it was kind of almost too soon. Like, I still don't think people were that good at it. But I think today it's better. But I still feel like I feel like one of the problems now is that it's still not as good as I think people think it is. And egg freezing is much better now. And I think taking that step even where you were talking about is what has made it difficult. So one of the difficult things about freezing an egg is when you freeze something, it expands. So that's the reason why your sodas explode in your freezer. That's why you can get foods and meats that end up going bad when they freeze. So with eggs, they have a lot of water. And so one of the problems we used to do is a thing called slow freezing. And when you would freeze it, it would build up a lot of crystallization, it would affect the eggs. And the thaw rate and the success rate were very low. When vitrification came around, which Dr. Salem talked about on one of the other episodes, where it's a very fast freeze, instead of freezing it slowly, you actually go and get lots of the water out, and then you freeze it with a flash. You're basically getting it to dehydrate, and then you're freezing it, and it becomes like a glass state. And so when people say that, what they're saying is not that it becomes glass, but when you think of glass, you think of it as a solid, but it's technically a liquid. And so the same thing, when we vitrify something, it doesn't actually become a solid, even though it's frozen. It's technically still moving, just really slow. And so when this happened, this allowed egg freezing to really start, happening. And, it's really progressed. It's got better. But I mean, talk about an interesting topic today. One of my patients today, unfortunately, thawed a lot of eggs, and they did not have an embryo that came out of these eggs. and it was a lot of eggs, and she did it when she was at the right age. I think that's some of the things we have to talk about today. But it was it's not perfect,
Yeah.
and obviously the people who are doing it now, obviously there's been more solutions that have been made, and we're getting better at it. But people who did in the past, it may not be as good. And then we talked about this once before about who the sperm is, right? So that's kind of the situation in this patient, is that it's probably a sperm issue, and so it's a bummer because she froze all these eggs in the past. And so, like you said, we've come a long way. I think egg freezing is a great option. At our clinic, we originally, when we started, only charged $1,000 for it because we wanted everyone to do it. And we thought, listen, we want people to, when they're very young, to do this, 25. But unfortunately, we found there were some problems with offering that low, that people tried to take advantage of it, and so we had to change it a little bit. But I still think it's an amazing thing. I just think one of the things that's really important is no one should freeze their eggs if they don't have to. Meaning, I see couples come in all the time, and this is actually a great question for you if you run into this. They'll be like, 34, 35, couple comes in, and they say to me, hey, I want to preserve my fertility. I want to freeze my eggs. And this is a couple that's already married and stuff. And I'm surprised by that. Why would you want to freeze your eggs? Just make embryos. And there are some obviously ethical reasons that people may have and stuff like that, religious reasons. But in the end, I think that's the thing that you wouldn't know if you look at egg freezing from other clinics or egg freezing that's online. It's not as good as we think. It's very good, but it's not as good as we think. And
Right.
I think sometimes there's that thought that, if I freeze my 10, I'm definitely getting a kid. And it's like, no, that's the average that we're recommending to freeze. But there's still the possibility you could have bad fertilization, you could have bad eggs. And so that's why I really want to talk about a little bit tonight when we're talking about this subject matter.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, that's such a great point. And I'm really happy that we can just be really super candid about this here, because I think what happens in some of the advertising media out there, et cetera, is that the real numbers that are behind egg freezing aren't fully disclosed, let's call it. And I think that it's important to understand how egg freezing works, but also the biology behind how you get from a frozen egg to a baby. And, so much of this, and the conversations that I always have with my patients go a little like this. I say, first of all, at this age that you're at, we have to have a target. And our target might be 15 eggs, let's say, at your age. And getting 15 eggs frozen doesn't mean that we'll have 15 eggs that are retrieved. Usually, you have a good fraction of your eggs that are retrieved that are not mature. So we're only freezing mature eggs, of course. And then the second part of that, after freezing the perfect ideal number of mature eggs, is that even in all our modeling studies, the published data would show that there's kind of this plateau to predict around 80%, meaning our best mathematical models show us that we can reliably give you a number of eggs needed to freeze to get about an 80% chance in the future of a live birth. And I think the question that comes back a lot is like, why are we topping out at 80%? Why can't we predict with 90% or 100%? And it goes back to some of these issues that there are unpredictable things about the future that we don't have any control over. The sperm, what about the uterus? I mean, maybe there are some issues with the uterus down the road. Maybe you have a case of bad biological luck. You have many embryos that are formed, but then they all turn out to be genetically abnormal. And so because we're so far upstream when we're freezing eggs, there's a lot that we still don't know. Now, I think it's important to have that perspective about egg freezing, but at the same time, I don't want to underscore the fact that it's the best tool that we have to preserve fertility. I mean, until something else comes along, we don't have a better tool. This is the best that we have, other than the basics of, hey, take good care of yourself, a good lifestyle, do those healthy things, good sleep, minimize exposure to toxic substances, alcohol, smoking, etc. I mean, those are things that we've always known about. And then this is the next newest, shiniest tool in that toolbox.
Yeah, I mean, and exactly that point. I think what's interesting is that number we tell people to get to, and obviously we're going to talk about that a little bit more here, but, talking to people about this. I wish if I would have known that this patient, wouldn't do well, I wish I could have done like a trial, like check with how her sperm goes with that guy, for maybe take 10 of those eggs and see how it goes. And if it didn't go well, I go, okay, maybe we want to change, are you willing to change the sperm donor or something like that? And I feel for women because for a lot of them, this is their only chance, right? And so now let's say they're 44, they go and they thaw some of those eggs, but they got a guy who has bad sperm. And in this situation, now, they go, do I choose to have a kid with them? I use my eggs, it doesn't work. Now I have to use donor eggs, and he gets to still use his sperm. And so egg freezing's always been tough for me. I know it works well in many cases, but I know many cases it doesn't. We've all seen the horrible case where someone, has 15, 20 eggs and none of them end up making embryos. And then we see the cases where someone has 6 and they get 3 embryos out of it and they have a pregnancy. It's just so hard. And I think that's one thing we should really talk about tonight, is that there is no safe number, right? I mean, there's a point where I think, sure, if you have 100 eggs, I think, you can feel pretty safe. But I still would never thaw them all at the same time. I would say almost doing them in cohorts and then, find out how things go. That's the interesting thing about IVF, is that when you have it, you can see how things went. You can see if there's problems. The problem is you're freezing these eggs. You have no idea what's going to happen in the future. You have no idea how well they're going to go through blastulation. You don't know what the sperm donor is. And so you're right. You hit the nail on the head. There is nothing else. I mean, there really is nothing else other than if you could clone yourself and freeze yourself for a future time. So it is the best thing we have, but I think it's important for people. And I think we need to do a better job educating as a society, meaning for society, that it doesn't always work that well. And so it's really important to not look at it as like a last ditch effort. So example we're going to probably be talking about here in a minute is, the 42-year-old patient comes in and says, okay, I want to freeze my eggs now. And you're like, whoa, this is not going to be easy. In some situations, I almost.
And why is that not going to be easy? Can you go into a little bit more depth about that? Why is it that at 42, it's not a hard no, you can't freeze your eggs, not at all. But why is it so difficult to overcome that element?
Yeah, it's the part you said. It's that biology of going from the egg all the way to a blastocyst that you can use. And so when you talk about the attrition that's going to occur, like you said, let's just use an example of 10 eggs. You start with 10 eggs and they freeze them. It sounds great. I got 10 eggs in the freezer. But you and I know that those 10 eggs, really, you're talking maybe 2 of them might be good, maybe 3. And so at that point, up to 80, 85% of the eggs are abnormal. So now you thaw those. Maybe 10% don't survive the thaw. Now you're down to 9 eggs. Of those 9 eggs, now you fertilize them. 70% are going to fertilize. So now you're down to 6 or 7 embryos. Of those 6 or 7 embryos, half are going to make it to blastocyst. You're like 3 or 4 embryos now. And we know that for someone at 42, to get an 85, 90% chance of a euploid embryo, you need about 7 to 8 embryos. And so that means of those 3 to 4 embryos they have, there is probably about 50% chance or lower there's not even a euploid embryo, being the normal embryo they use. And that's the hard part about it. And that's just assuming everything goes perfectly as planned, right? I mean, now, like we talked about, we know the sperm donors. And I actually even tell people sometimes what's more important to them. Is it more important for them to have frozen eggs for a partner in the future, or they just want to have a baby with their eggs? And if they just want to have a baby, I've told many women that there's nothing wrong being a single mom and just using a sperm donor. And at least then they're going to know what they have. They know they have a baby in their arms, not just a potential for a baby in the future. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a very interesting question. I mean, that gets back to, bigger questions about, things that how people view their family building and bigger questions about their goals to family building. And I think this fits into that conversation very nicely. I think egg freezing is a great part of that conversation. And I think any good fertility doctor should definitely have a more holistic conversation about what the family building goals are for that woman, and making sure that egg freezing fits into that plan. Because I'll give you a couple examples. I had a patient not long ago who came to me, and she was 32, and she was very, very adamant that she wanted egg freezing. And at the same time, she said, but we're going to try to have, a pregnancy next year. We're going to start trying, but we've never tried before. She had no underlying reason for having infertility or having anything. And I said, hey, what's your family building? What are your goals? What does that look like? And, she said, I'd love to have 2 children in the future. And, again, I'm going to start in a year, and I just want to make sure that I can have children next year. And I said, well, to be honest, if you just try starting next year and you're unsuccessful, you're in that 15% of couples who are unsuccessful in achieving a pregnancy after a year, then we can explore fertility treatments at that point. And that's going to be a more efficient path for you than egg freezing today and then having to do a fertility treatment for you in the future. And at the same time, for the vast majority of 33-year-old women, they'll get pregnant. And then if they try to birth space for a year and a half, they'll get pregnant again for their second child. So again, I think it ended up being a very valuable conversation. I think there were some distortions of what her perceptions were of her own fertility. I think there was this idea that I'm 33 now. The minute I hit 35, I'm going to be infertile. And that's obviously not true. And I think going through that conversation was really helpful. And the flip side of that is that there are some people that are 33 and they're just in the midst of launching their career or doing something where they know off to the military or something, and they know they're not going to be able to have children for 5 or 6 years. And then it starts to make more sense because the quality, the genetic quality of those eggs at 33 is pretty different from at 38. And for that individual, it makes more sense. So I think it goes back to this idea of, hey, egg freezing is phenomenal, but it's a precision tool that shouldn't just be a blanket tool for everybody.
I've heard people sometimes say that they think that the people should freeze their eggs by 38. But in your opinion, and again, I know it's opinion, what do you think is the perfect time to freeze eggs? I mean, for women, I don't know that we can come up with an exact number, but just in general, like if you had a daughter and she will say, not getting pregnant or not ready to have a kid, what would be that ideal age where you say, I'd probably do it by this time versus waiting until 38 or 40 or something like that?
Yeah. Well, I do have a daughter, and I probably one day we'll have this conversation with her, and I hope that by then egg freezing has gotten better and better and better. I think there are times when egg freezing, again, when we're not talking about you're having to go through chemotherapy or some treatment like that. That's a different thing. But you're doing it because you want to have children in the future and you're just not ready yet. And the genetic drop off in egg quality, it happens linearly for the most part. And so again, I don't think you have to freeze your eggs when you're in your early 20s or your mid 20s. But I do think that if you can, if it is accessible to you, and you can freeze eggs earlier, you will get more benefit out of it than if you freeze them later. So if I had to, just kind of put a number on the board, I think the early 30s to the mid 30s are the kind of perfect time to freeze eggs. You're going to get the most benefit out of them. But in the late 30s, there is still a real opportunity there to do it as long as you get really good counseling around how many eggs you need to have frozen. It's going to be a significant number. And I think that should be the goal. It shouldn't be like, I'm going to go through a cycle of egg freezing. I mean, or at least you should understand what the number of eggs that are frozen, what that will give you in the future. And I think in the early 40s, there's still a role for it. But I think this is when we need to be very cautious about how we talk about it. And this is where I start to worry a little bit, is about how we talk about it when people are egg freezing, in their early 40s.
Yeah. That's about exactly what I would say. I'd say somewhere between like 30, 33, if you're going to do it. I think there is a benefit than waiting till, you're 36, 37. I know where the 38 comes from is at that point, there's a steep decline. And so you really lose a lot of the cost advantage of doing egg freezing once you get past 38. Um, 35, you start to see that decrease. And that's why I don't want everyone waiting to 35. But if you know you're going to do it, you're working at, let's say, a Facebook or something like that, and you have the coverage and you think I want to freeze your eggs, I think that's probably a good age. I agree with that 100%. What about people like, professional women though? They're in medical school or something like that. Same thing. I mean, they have the opportunity to do it early. As a matter of fact, I'm actually going to be doing a talk about it with them. What do you think with regards to that? I mean, it's to me, I think it's great because it allows them to not worry about those things and that they have these frozen eggs. But I think I always go back to that same point: is don't rely on this though. I mean, don't look at this because I do see that a lot. I see people say like, "We'll get this, and then we're going to wait a few years to have kids." And I'm like, wait, no, make embryos. Don't do that. Like at least embryos, you have a much higher chance. I don't know. Like I said, I've seen families who are in medical school not wanting to get pregnant now, want to postpone the pregnancy for until they're done with all the residency and stuff. I don't want to wait. What do you think? I mean, would you push them more towards embryo freezing, or would you say the egg freezing? And I think next we can talk about why someone would do that. I mean, obviously there are reasons why someone would only
Yeah.
freeze egg.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's such a great point. So I'm of two minds when it comes to this, and I'd be curious. Maybe we kind of have a little difference of opinion, and I'd really welcome that. But so I think the first thing is that we do know that there's good data around the fact that especially for women who are in medicine and who are in healthcare, they actually experience infertility at a higher rate than the general population. We see some statistics as high as 1 in 4 women will have some issues with fertility that are in medicine, and it probably has to do with a lot of things. But so with that in mind, and with the fact that just the training and everything takes so long, uh, I think that it becomes more and more obvious that it could be a good solution for them to pursue. Now, here's the problem with it. Traditionally, as you're going through your medical training, or if you're in healthcare or whatever, you're in tons of debt forever as you're going through this process, and you're in no financial space to go through it. And then to kind of add insult to injury, most facilities don't. Most of our training programs never cover egg freezing. So I really applaud like the companies like Apple and Google and those places who really spearheaded egg freezing in the early days for their employees. That hasn't happened yet in medicine across the board. There are a few institutions that do it, but and this is one of those things where I think we really need more advocacy. We need to go in there and say, hey, if you're going to keep us in training for this long, help us out a little bit down the road.
Yeah.
And I think that would be a minimum. Now, here's the part about it that I'll be really interested to hear your opinion. So it is true that if you freeze embryos, you're further downstream, meaning what you have. And so if you freeze 2 or 3 genetically normal embryos, you have all the benefit of knowing you have these great embryos. They have a very high thaw survival rate, 99%, very high thaw survival rates. And again, what the rough statistics are behind how they should implant and everything. If you're upstream with eggs, you have a lot less data. But there is this question that you were talking about earlier, which is something that, we feel really bad when this happens. And it's this idea of reproductive autonomy, right? Like, what if something happens to that couple and they're not together anymore? And now that woman has, committed her eggs to sperm, and you can't do that. You can't, go back on that. And that takes away quite a bit of reproductive autonomy from that individual. So it's an exchange. And I think the exchange is more reproductive autonomy, less certainty with egg freezing, more certainty, less reproductive autonomy with embryo freezing. And I think, again, it's one of these conversations that's important to have. You could even do split cycles if you want, but
Yep.
I always tell even couples that are thinking about fertility preservation to highly consider egg freezing.
Yeah, I do agree with you. I tend to tell them to do splits. So I say to them,
Mm.
you can freeze eggs for you. And I say the same thing you said. You don't know if you're going to be together. I mean, 50% of people usually get divorced. I mean, there's always that possibility. It's still very early on. So I think that's a very fair argument. Um, I think being someone who's been infertile, there's times where I just feel like, I don't know, having the higher chance to me is still, worth it more. But you're right. What you talked about. I had this couple, the kind of interesting story. She was a great person, had made embryos with this guy. And it was about a year later they were going to use them. Now she's like 43. Her fertility reserve is horrible. And she finds out she's cheating on him, and they get divorced. And now she can't make eggs on her own, and she can't use that embryo. And this was before actually Arizona, I think I've told you before, changed the law now where if you have an embryo with another person, and even if they don't want to be with you, you have the right to still use it. And that is actually to allow women who, who potentially are past their primes and then they can't use their own eggs, can still use them. And so, it's not the wrong or right. I mean, that's exactly, it's just an opinion. And that's kind of why I tell them, I go, what's more important? Is it more important that you have the highest chance of having a baby, or is it more like you said, more important to have the autonomy to have it with anyone? And the
Yeah.
best way you can do both. Not everyone has that option. And I said, in Arizona, I know we have that law. It's very controversial. I'm not sure if other states have that, but that's a good point. And I think they're both the right answers. I think that's where the doctor and you have to talk and find out what's best for you both. I know Lauren's been waiting here for us, so we don't have Ari tonight, unfortunately. And so Dr. Sam and I are going to be both the MC, and we're also going to be talking. So we'll bring Lauren on here in a minute to ask some questions. And please, if anyone's interested in asking questions, go to the website, Sperm Meets Egg. And then there you can get into the show, and you don't have to show your face if you don't want to. And we're more than happy to answer any questions for you. So I'm going to bring Lauren onto the stage here. And Lauren, we don't see you, but we should be able to hear you, and we wanted to see what questions you have for us.
Hi. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Well, I didn't know that I was on deck for questions, but I mean, I do have one. I'm the one who froze my eggs 10 times, if you remember. I was wondering, I'm trying to date right now and find someone quickly that I like enough to marry. But I was wondering, is there really a big difference? And I know it's a case by case basis probably, but is there really a big difference if I were to get a sperm donor, a young sperm donor with frozen sperm, or maybe a 45-year-old man, I guess, based on averages? Is there really going to be a big difference with how my frozen eggs would do? Or what do you think?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's a very valid question when we were talking earlier about, depending who your sperm donor is going to be. And might keep you live here for a second because I want to make sure we answer this to your satisfaction. But there could be, is what I could tell you. I'm not too worried about a guy at 45. Yes, there's going to be some. If you look at overall sperm when the guy is young, let's say 80% of his sperm is doing better. It's actually not that high. I'm being a little bit generous there, and then at the 45-year-old, he's going to have more problems like DNA fragmentation. But because there's so much sperm, in the end, there's still good sperm there with the 45-year-old, and you would do overall fine. Now, obviously, I don't know what that 45-year-old sperm is going to be like, but we're making the assumption that it's good, is what you're saying, and that, hey, is the DNA issues going to be? Once you start getting up in the 50s, and then especially 60s, that's when really you start to see some significant changes in the sperm. I had a consult with someone today with that exact same thing, and I had to explain to them that they were going to be spending a lot of money on donor eggs, and I said to them that there's a little bit of concern here with the sperm, and that we should evaluate it first, make sure we know what we're working with. And as long as you know the sperm has problems, you can make some adjustments. I'd be interested to see what you have to say, Dr. Salem, on this too. I mean, like I said, I don't get too worried about 45. I mean, are you kind of the same boat there?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, again, if you look at like, to answer your question precisely, just like Dr. Amo said, I mean, there's a little bit of some increased things that happen as men get above 40, above 45, but really we start to see it pick up a little bit above 50. So practically speaking, like what are we talking about? Well, there's a little bit of a higher miscarriage rate, for example, among women who start a pregnancy with a little bit of an older male partner, and especially above the age of 50. Again, there are some single gene mutation issues that happen, again, more so above the age of 50. These are very rare things, though, right? These are really rare. So on the whole, I wouldn't pick that one thing out. Now, here's another way to think about it too. Sometimes you don't know if your sperm donor has ever started a pregnancy before. It's unproven for male, unproven fertility. And maybe the 45-year-old gentleman has started a pregnancy. So again, that's another variable to take into consideration when you're talking about all of these things, because one has proven fertility and the other maybe doesn't. So, and ultimately, this is a super personal decision. And we have the tools to help you do both things, but it's ultimately your choice. And I think that's what really matters.
Thank you.
And you said you went through multiple cycles and hopefully have multiple eggs, and that does give you some flexibility, right? And so I think the one thing I would tell you that I said in the beginning is, if it's really important for you to have a pregnancy with your eggs, and if the sperm isn't good, I mean, that's a discussion you guys can have and say, listen, let's try with some of the eggs, but if it's not working, you might want to have a child with your DNA, and you may say, can I use a sperm donor? Or say that's one thing I would want to do at that time. But most of the time it's fine. I don't want people to be so worried about that. There's just all these men out there with horrible sperm. But like I said, it's just an important thing. I try to look at both sides of it. And the one thing we are lucky as guys is we always have sperm, whereas
Right.
with women, there's a finite time, and so I think it's always going to look that. Did you have any other questions or comments or about that?
Yeah. I mean, if I start dating a guy, and I spend any quantity of time with him, I'm gonna ask him to do a sperm analysis and DNA fragmentation test and see a urologist. I mean, is that kind of covering my bases? I mean, I know it's not 100%, but I mean, if I present that to my fertility doctor, that should be giving a good assessment of what I'll be working with, right?
Yeah, I don't think you even have to go that far. I
Really?
would tell you a semen analysis is very reasonable. And again, it's a very reasonable thing to ask. If it's important for me, if I want kids, I say to someone, listen, I want to make sure you can have kids. It's a very reasonable thing to ask. The sperm DNA fragmentation, I mean, in the end, even if they have it, there's things you can do for that. There's like the Zymod chip and things that you can do to help with that. So I don't know if you need to know that right away. I think the
Okay.
sperm count's the biggest one. And same thing with a urologist. There's not really much they're going to do if the count is good.
Okay.
So I'd say really the semen analysis. Now, obviously, have a fertility doctor tell you the results of it. So then that way you can, know if you need to do something or not. But in general, that's what I think. So.
Yeah, I thought it was important to go to the urologist because there's this thing that I don't know how to pronounce. It starts with a V, varicole something.
Varicocele?
Yes. And
Yes.
so apparently that's a big problem if you have it. So
If it affects the sperm. So again, if you have one, there's men out there with varicoceles who are having tons of babies, right?
Oh, really? Okay.
I'm always an open book. I have a varicocele. That was
Okay.
one of the things that I had the problem with. It can sometimes cause pain. It can cause infertility. And so I had it and it caused some infertility. But if his sperm count's normal, the varicocele probably is not going to affect things as much.
Okay. And then I'm under the impression that a man's sperm, unless he has like a true medical diagnosis, maybe, I mean, to improve a man's sperm, it's very receptive to vitamins and supplements and possibly medications, right? You can really improve it with those things, right? And lifestyle changes, maybe also, right? Or not really?
Well, yes, but yes, and I would say I would start with lifestyle, right? That's going to have a much bigger impact on good sperm quality for men, right? So a lot of times we see guys, they're just popping all these supplements and doing all these things, but then they're drinking really heavily on the weekends with their buddies, and that alcohol is going to have a really pretty significant impact on sperm quality. So when we think about holistically, how can we improve sperm quality? It comes down to the basics. Eat, a good diet that's not too high in sugars, not too high in carbohydrates. A lot of green leafy vegetables, high antioxidant diet. Keep the testicles cool. That's a really key thing. They're outside of the body for a reason. That's what I always say. It's because they want to be a little bit cooler out there. And then after you do all these things for the, exercise and healthy weight and all these various good things, after that, yes, of course, we can layer in the supplements. But I will tell you, there were some recent studies trying to really show definitively that supplements are helpful, and they didn't come back showing that.
Really?
And so we still think that there's probably some benefit. It hasn't been teased out quite yet, but the most recent really big, super robust study trying to look at that was actually stopped early because it wasn't showing that it was helpful.
Wow. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to say, I really appreciate you being so honest and open and candid about the success of egg freezing. I'm in, some egg freezing groups on Facebook and Reddit, and I love reading about, real stories of how girls end up, how their eggs thaw and what the results are. And I paid close attention to that. And it's so interesting that some are totally fine and then some are not fine. And it's so tricky. And I never, while I was doing the egg freezing, I didn't fully understand how challenging it is for the embryologist and the fertility doctors to get a live birth from these frozen eggs. I mean, now I have a better understanding about it because I've learned so much, but it's so tricky because some girls do fine and some girls don't do fine. And it's like, I don't know where I'm going to fall, on that scale. So we'll just see how it goes, but it's so tricky.
Thanks so much, Lauren, for coming on.
Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah.
So we'll take you off and if you want to keep listening, go to one of our things so we can open up for other people too. But Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.
It's something she just said, and I think it's a really important point, is that there is no guarantee, and that's the really hard part. And I wish I could give someone that number, what's that number for them to be guaranteed? And there is none. And like you said, it's not always good. So well, we're going to go next here. We're going to bring another person on. Before we go on, any questions or anything you wanted to add to that?
That's exactly right. I think the only other minor thing that it always has me thinking about is, short of a guarantee, what's the best strategy for egg freezing? And I feel like if I could create a perfect world, I would want to help patients, women who are egg freezing, get them to their ideal number. That would be my perfect world. I would say to them, you're going to need 20 eggs to have that 80% chance of success in the future. Let's work together to get there and, not have to kind of worry whether that takes 2 or 3 cycles and things like that. That would be my perfect world, but that's just my 2 cents.
I can't imagine. And again, maybe, I can't imagine someone freezing those eggs. Like this morning when I had talked to that patient and they not work, and you just feel like everything I put towards that, and then they're not, you don't have it. I can't even imagine what the letdown is. That's the part that's I always feel so horrible about when we tell people these numbers, is that there's no guarantee. And that's why I always go back to that point that, there's no guarantee with embryos either, but there's more probability sometimes. And like I said, but the ones I feel the worst for, obviously even like cancer patients. So, it's horrible if it doesn't work in the future. Well, let me get Dakota on here. So Dakota, we got you on the stage here, and we'd love to hear your question.
Hey, Dr. Amols.
How are you doing?
Good. So, thanks, doctors, for your time. Just had a quick question when it comes to PGS testing embryos that were already frozen. So, what are the studies currently saying, if you already have frozen embryos and you choose to thaw them to do PGS testing and then refreeze? Is there a pretty significant risk worth worrying about and how that can affect the success of the embryo?
Yeah. I mean, I talked about this on one of our other shows. There has been studies looking at this, and in these studies, what it showed is that if you go and you thaw an embryo that has not been biopsied before, and then you biopsy it, it doesn't appear to affect the chances. Okay. Now the problem with this is this was at this center that they did this, right? You can find a study somewhere that says, oh, it's harder because if someone's not, let's say, as good as the biopsy. So I can tell you I've had personal experience where I've seen embryologists who are extremely good at biopsies, and then I've seen some that are not very good at biopsies, and that can affect it. When you thaw an embryo, it's a little bit different because when you thaw it, if it's not expanding and kind of hatching out of the shell, it makes the biopsy a little bit harder. So I think it's fair to say there can be risk. And obviously, anytime you do these things, there's more risk. There's risk associated with it. But in general, like at our clinic, I don't think there's any higher risk thawing an embryo and doing a biopsy on it and put it back, at least at our clinic. A rebiopsy is a little bit different. So, taking another biopsy after a biopsy, that has effect. And there's been some studies that have shown the quality of your embryo matters too. So there was one study that looked at if you had a C quality embryo, which would be like the lowest end of the embryos, even taking more than like 4 cells can start to see a decrease in pregnancy rates. When you get to
why would somebody rebiopsy?
So sometimes the results always don't come back normal. So for example, like let's say you send them out and it comes back unclear, or if it comes back, even though the data was there, what happens is that it can't really read them because there's so many spikes that they can't be confident in their answer. And so they don't want to tell you it's normal. They want to tell you it's abnormal. So they call it either chaotic or kind of unreadable. But there are even times where the DNA, when it's tracking to the place, can actually break down. And so by the time they get it, there's just not enough information for them to be able to do analysis. And then some people rebiopsy. And most time we tell people if it's like an A embryo, really good embryo, it's not unreasonable to rebiopsy, but the lower quality it is, it will actually reduce your chances significantly. And so back to that point, with the thawing and the freezing, depending on the quality embryo affects it too. But in general, I mean, Dr. Salem, have you seen anything that said that thawing an embryo that has not been biopsied before and then biopsying it, does it have any significant differences in pregnancy?
Yeah, no, definitely not significant differences. I mean, again, so we're talking first an unbiopsied embryo, thawing that single embryo, then biopsying it, and then now here's the one thing that, now this is so minor, but it's something to remember. You're technically freezing an embryo, thawing it, biopsying it, freezing it again. You're freezing it again, of course, to get those results back. So, in theory, if we say there's just that 1% thaw risk, right? When you go to thaw an embryo, it's very small. I mean, 99% of the embryos are going to do just fine thawing out. But if there's a little bit of that risk anywhere, it's probably that 1% thaw survival risk there. Now, the other part of it, just like you said, Dr. Amols, I mean, it's, I do remember a study out of Cornell once, and I think it was showing about a 10% decrease if you biopsied the embryo, and then froze it and then rebiopsied it. And that kind of makes sense to me, right? You're taking 5 to 10 cells off that first time and then another 5 to 10. That's a lot for the embryo to take on. So, but yeah, that would be the only other thing that I would add to it. Yeah.
Thanks. Any other questions you have for us?
No, that's everything tonight. Thank you.
Well, hey, thanks so much. We're gonna take you off here, and then, like I said, we're gonna open up the slot for someone else. So if you want to continue watching, just watch us on one of the social medias. Okay? Thanks.
No problem. I hope to catch you on the other streaming site soon.
Exactly, my 491. See you later.
Thank you.
What we're gonna do next is we'll get Kara on here. I know she has a question for us, and we'll get her on next. There was, like I said, that study that did quantify, and they really did look at embryos that had more cells, did better with bigger biopsies. And so again, I think that's where we tell people not to rebiopsy at our clinic if it's a C grade, and at that point don't rebiopsy, and that would be kind of like a B grade on the Gardner system. So if you're looking at the different type of systems, I mean, basically, unless it's an A embryo at the Gardner system or at our place it's AB, we wouldn't recommend rebiopsying it because it will lower your chances. Now, that being said, if you have some disease that you don't want your child to get, well, I mean, you're going to take the risk, right? It's worth having a lower pregnancy chance than that. And so I think that's one of those type of things you just got to talk to your doctor about. So let me add Kara here. Kara, you are now live on the stage with us. Thanks for coming on the show today. You have any questions for us?
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. I am so grateful to New Directions. I thankfully have two children at home with me tonight, which has been an awesome blessing. But we are actually planning for our next transfer. And based on my transfer history, we are trying to decide on how many embryos to transfer. And so, just for quick history, my first transfer with two PGS embryos was one live birth, which was awesome. She's my 2.5-year-old. And then the next transfer was a fail with just one PGS embryo. And then the third transfer, I transferred again 2 PGS normal embryos and one live birth from that. So we have 3 embryos left, all PGS normal, a 5BB, 5BC, and a 5BC. And we are, of course, we understand the risk with twins and whatnot. We've transferred 2 twice, and that we've only, received one child, with God's blessing, of course, from those transfers. So we're just trying to figure out, do we transfer 2 for the one live birth or just stick with one, and kind of what our odds are, and with the 3 embryos left, kind of where we should go.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I'm actually I did this podcast. I want to do one on this about statistics. And it's this interesting thought about, if you flip a quarter, right, and you get heads, you flip it again, is your chances still heads or tails? And there's a flip flop. I actually had this debate with a doctor one time where there was this, we do allow 2, not all clinics allow 2, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's their choice. We do allow people to put up with 2. And this doctor actually said that, all clinics should have to do 1, and that when people have failed, like you're talking about, implant, then they'll put back 2. But they were talking about completely failing. And I brought up to this doctor that day, I said to him, I said, well, listen, if you flip a quarter and you get heads, flip a quarter again. I said, what's your chance of getting heads again? Getting tails this time? And he said, 50%. And I said, exactly. And what he understood from that was I was making the point that even if you fail 3 times, right, when you do that next transfer, your chances are still the same. It doesn't change now just because you've failed technically. If you're saying that, we're talking about euploid embryos here, so I want to make sure I make that clear.
Yeah.
It's still kind of the same chances. Now, the thought process we have, though, is the fact that maybe my embryos aren't as good, right, or something's wrong. But I go back to that same principle with him, which is, if you don't want twins, I never recommend putting back 2. And I think Dr. would be right there with me. I've even changed my thought process, and I do believe 1's always the safest and the best. And I think that's really a very fair comment. But your concern is still there, which is, hey, I put back 2. I've only got 1. And so you can, I see where your argument is, but I would still say 1 unless you want the risk of twins, because just like flip that quarter, you put back 2, they both have a chance coming in. And statistics are about 60% for those euploid embryos. And so, Dr. Salem, I'd love to hear what you have to say too about this, but I think we're very similar in this thought.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, Kara, it's such a great question. And I mean, I'll talk kind of like more broadly. I mean, I think, there are probably like nuances to your case, Kara, that like, that I like, I don't know, obviously. And so I think to take a step back, there are kind of two really big tools that we use to measure up an embryo, to assess how likely is this embryo going to take. And one is whether it's euploid or not, whether it's genetically normal or not, if we do PGT testing. And the other one is looking at the morphology, or basically like, what does the embryo look like under the microscope? And we have this whole scoring system that we do for it. And when you put the two together, you can really kind of tease apart the very, very, very best embryos that are going to have, a 70% chance of implanting and leading to a baby, to, the lowest grade ones, which might be like day 7 embryos that are, graded a BB or a CC. And those are going to have a much lower likelihood of taking. So I think this is why IVF is such a case by case basis. And that's why it's important to have these conversations with your doctor. It's really not a one size fits all. And in this case, sometimes people might have gone through, 1 or 2 single embryo transfers and been successful, or, so we're going to say, let's just pretend that they've been successful with those single embryo transfers, and they're coming for their third child, let's say, and they have 2 embryos that are remaining, but individually the embryos have a very low likelihood of taking compared to their best embryos. Then that's where we might have a conversation about, hey, would you want to transfer 2 embryos, understanding that there's a significant chance for twins here. The guidelines are clear around single embryo transfer. But I think the guidelines also don't take into consideration the color that is painted by the morphology, right? There's a big difference between a very high quality embryo that's like a 5AA on day 5 versus an embryo that is a day 6 or day 7 CC or BC or something like that. And that's where the guidelines break down. That's where, at these margins, the guidelines don't tell us the whole story. So I agree with you, Dr. Amols. I think it's a conversation to be had. And sometimes it is important to make sure we are talking about, whether we should transfer 1 or 2. Now, there's one more point that I want to make. And that's that transferring 2 embryos doesn't improve the rate of the other embryo taking, right? It's not like something magical happens when there are 2 embryos in there and that one is making the other one more likely to stick or something. It's just that there's this like cumulative higher chance of one or the other working. And actually, when they've done studies looking at this in a very different way, your best chances of getting the maximum number of pregnancies out of, say, 3 embryos that are euploid is to transfer them sequentially, like 1, then 1, then 1. But what's the problem with that? Time, money, emotional roller coaster. Like, that's medicine. We're humans. Like, we don't want to ride this emotional roller coaster over and over and over. So I think these are the things that need to be considered as we talk about these things. And these are things Dr. Amols and I talk about all the time.
Yeah, and on that thought, just so people understand, like, because clearly 2 is better than 1. I mean, that's a pretty obvious thing. That's going to be a higher chance, but it's a higher chance of being pregnant. But the goal is a live birth. And so specifically what we're talking about is by putting 1 back at a time, you have the best chance of coming away with a live birth. So if you take the cumulative pregnancy rate, you say, okay, I do 1 transfer, then a second transfer, and here's my chances of a live birth. And you do put 2 back, it might be here, but it's actually slightly higher doing 1 at a time because, as he was suggesting, if something goes wrong, let's say with one of those pregnancies, you could potentially lose the other embryo, right? So if you have bleeding, you can lose it. Now your pregnancy is higher risk. Now, you end up having preterm delivery so early that you lose the pregnancies. And so it's interesting. I mean, Kara, sorry, I said Lauren. Kara, it's interesting because I was always a big believer in putting 2 because I put in 2 every time, and that's because I was doing IVF back in the time when rates weren't as good, and so you always put back 2. You'd be almost crazy not to. But the rates have got so good now that, as Dr. Salem said, the recommendations by the American Society of Reproductive Medicine says 1 pretty much across the board. But I do think there's still part of being a doctor and looking at the situation. Was this a day 7 embryo? Is it a mosaic embryo, right? And then making those type of decisions, you want to put back more than 1 in that situation. So it's clear cut on what the recommendation is, but just like everything, there's gray areas, and that's when we go. And so for you, I think the big question is, I'm not going to be able to tell you what to do, but I think the question is, how important is it to, if you know you only want 1 more kid or something like that, and you're okay with twins, then I think it's not unreasonable. But if you're saying, hey, I want to get the most amount of pregnancies out of this, then as Dr. Salem said, 1 at a time is going to give you your best chance.
Dad told me that.
Thank you.
That cute little voice in the background.
Right.
So
She's like, who are you talking to? My doctor. My last, just kind of on that topic, is if you put in 2 different grade euploid embryos, is there any like I guess disadvantage in that in regards to like, I don't know, harming the better embryo, or like, do they both have equal opportunity to implant, like with, of course, the exception of if they're different grades, they have maybe different chances. But is there like any battle of the fittest or something like that? Because as I shared, I've transferred twice with 2 embryos and 1 has stuck both times. So I just kind of wonder what happened, or how that may affect my decision for my next transfer.
Yeah, this is such a great question too, and it touches on a topic that I wanted to just like touch on for a minute before we kind of leave this topic. But so there isn't like some battle between the embryos as to one is trying to kind of outcompete the other for space or something like that. There are some things to keep in mind about what can happen though when you put 2 embryos in, because there are all these variations of what can happen with 2 embryos. For example, you could have 2 implants and then 1 could miscarry, and all the bleeding, the inflammation from the miscarriage of the one could inadvertently cause the other one to miscarry as well. That would be really unfortunate if the other one would have otherwise done well on its own. There's also the situation in which you have what's called like a vanishing twin, and this idea that kind of the pregnancy behaves like a twin pregnancy. And what do I mean by that? Well, the obstetric risk increases when you have this vanishing twin syndrome, basically. So you have only 1 baby that's growing, but because the pregnancy had originally started with 2, you might have an increased risk of like preterm delivery or preeclampsia or things like this. And again, this goes back to what Dr. Amols and I were saying, which is like, our biggest goal for you is a healthy mom and a healthy baby, and everybody to have a smile on their face as they're leaving the hospital. And that doesn't usually, we don't want people to deliver very preterm, of course. We don't want babies to stay in the NICU if we can avoid it. It's going to happen sometimes, and those facilities are great, and those babies do great too. But if we can help you avoid these things, then that's usually kind of the better path. And so those are the things to kind of consider in the background as we talk about, are there increased risks when you transfer 2 embryos, even if only 1 sticks? And there are. But there are things to consider like that. I don't know. What do you think, Dr. Amols?
Yeah, I mean, I completely echo that. I think one thing also to talk about, and maybe this is would be another discussion for a different time, is I think sometimes there is some confusion between grading when it's tested versus grading untested. And untested AA versus the untested CC is significant, especially when you take certain things like age into account. But a tested AA versus a tested CC there's not as much of a difference in pregnancy rates, meaning it's a much smaller range. And that's because if you look at the data, what you find is a lot of those AA embryos or A embryos end up having genetically being normal if you don't test them. And the ones that have the lower grades have a higher chance of being abnormal, just like a day 7 has a higher chance of being abnormal. So the problem is we've got so stuck on grading where grading affects chances that we forget now in this new, future of testing embryos, we're really kind of starting with a little bit of a clean slate. There's definitely differences. No one questions that. There's differences between day 7, day 6, and day 5, but it's not as significant. So when people worry about, like, I'm putting an AA with a CC or something like that, but if they're tested, not that big of a difference to the point that I think you have to worry about one not going. I want to bring up the point about statistics, though, and that is, you mentioned, like, I've done this twice and it hasn't worked, and that seems almost impossible. I mean, it is so hard to understand why an embryo won't implant. But when you think about it, there's at least a 40% chance that you were not going to end up with twins. That's a really big number. I mean, we don't think of that as a really big number, but I mean, if I always tell people, imagine if I told you today that if you left your house, you had a 40% chance of dying. You would be like, okay, this is a Netflix day. I'm going to watch all the episodes of this because that's too risky. And so even with 2 transfers, again, that's a 40% chance in that situation of not coming away with twins. It seems really shocking, but it's not as bad as those statistics sound. I always tell people out of 3 embryos, I probably only expect up to 2 pregnancies, live births from it. So with 4 embryos, sure, we would have expected at least 2 live births from it, which it sounds like there was. And maybe there could have been another one, but it's not that far off, actually, when you look at it from a statistical standpoint. So.
Thank you. That makes so much sense. Yeah, two for 5, I guess, right now. So maybe if I just transfer one, we're all set.
Or 2, exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. You want to say something?
Thank you.
You are welcome. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, doctors.
Thanks so
Great
much.
night. Yeah, have a great night.
It's interesting. One of the situations I have, I don't know if you've ever had this before, but I have a patient who has a mosaic embryo, and they say to me, "Listen, I don't want to just do one because it costs me a certain amount." Or, like, for example, people with progeny. I mean, we deal with this all the time. They have 1/4 of a smart cycle for a transfer, so half a transfer, and they want to do a transfer. And they're like, "I only get one shot at this. Can we put back the mosaic and the normal one?" Because they're like, the mosaic's a low chance. I don't want to do that by itself. I always have the issue with that. I wasn't sure if you do. My concern is, and it's purely emotional, which is, I tell them, if only one takes, they're going to be worried now the whole time. Which one is it? Was it a mosaic? Was it the normal? And I feel like they can't enjoy the pregnancy. And I don't tell people they can't do it, but it's something I usually advise against. I wasn't sure if you've had that situation where someone had a mosaic, that euploid, and they wanted to put both back because their concern was not putting back a mosaic by itself because the chances are only about 40%. So they feel like, I don't want to do that for less than 50% chance. Have you ever had that before?
Oh, definitely. I've also had the situation where, it was at the end of the very beginning of a IVF cycle with their first embryo transfer, and they have a couple of good embryos, and they say, well, I want to transfer one of the mosaics first, just in case that one works, and then I'm good because I know I have these 2 other good embryos, and I'm hoping to have 2 or 3 kids total, let's say, or something like that. And again, that's not something that I'll allow. But the big thing here has a lot to do with the ethos of medicine and reproductive medicine, which is what we're trying to help you do is come away with the best possible outcome. And we're OBGYNs first, then fertility doctors. That's how our training goes. And so with a mosaic embryo, if you're transferring a mosaic embryo, you're always in the back of your mind thinking that, hey, this could be an embryo that actually ends up forming into a chromosomally abnormal pregnancy, which could lead to a miscarriage, but it could also lead to an abnormal pregnancy down the road. And if we have a euploid embryo, why would we kind of put those two together? Again, the ethos of this is to give you the best, outcome first. Then if we're really far down the road and, hey, we can't do any more IVF cycles, we only have this one mosaic embryo left, then we can talk about transferring that. But again, transferring two embryos, it goes back to all these obstetric risks that we were talking about. Like, what if both do work? The euploid and the mosaic embryo work. Now we have a twin pregnancy, and it gets us into a world of hurt potentially. So I think it's best to kind of keep things simple. Our success rates are so high nowadays. We have the luxury of being able to do that. And I don't want to discount the fact that sometimes it takes an extra transfer to get there. I will acknowledge that. Like, sometimes it takes an extra transfer to get there. But realistically, that's an extra month of treatment. I'm not ignoring the cost of that at all, but I think in the big picture of everything, it's worth it. That's my viewpoint.
Yeah, I agree. I know we're kind of out of time here, but I feel bad we didn't get to any of the questions that we have, because we've just had a lot of people who wanted to ask questions live. I thought we could maybe knock a few of these out because they seem a little simple. One of them was, at what point in fertilization is a fertilized egg considered an embryo? Great question right now after that whole ruling things, and basically from the point the next day when we look at it, once we see the single cell embryo with two pronuclears in it and two polar bodies, we know it's an embryo at that point. So even as a single cell, that's the definition of an embryo at that point. You want to hit this? There was one question about, I think it's a good one. How long am I able to keep my egg frozen? I'm in my late 20s.
Yeah.
You want to hit that?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, this is so theoretically, I mean, with vitrification, we think it's like near indefinitely. There's already been many, pregnancies from eggs that have been frozen, 10 plus years, 15 plus years. But it's just important to remember the big batch of people who have done, the big group of people who have done egg freezing, it's just happened really in the last 5 years. So we may very well get more meaningful data on this 10, 15 years from now. But for right now, we think that if you vitrify your eggs and they are frozen for a year versus 5 years, there's effectively no difference.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, it's we haven't even had vitrification around for 20 years yet, so we don't even have that type of data. Slow freezing, we have a little bit more. That was the recent 29 years being frozen embryo that was thawed and some of the pregnancy with. There was a paper, and we won't go into this a lot because you have to read the paper, so I'm kind of throwing this at you, but there was a paper I read a while ago that talked about, and this was not a double-blind study, so this was just kind of like retrospectively looking back, and they looked at, from the point of making embryos to the point of doing transfer, that there was a decrease in pregnancy rate. And they, the question that comes up is, oh, well, maybe someone had endo, so that's why they had to wait 6 months, right? So there are causes that can cause that to happen. But that paper brought up the question is, how we really study this long enough to find out, like, does an embryo that's been in 5 years, does it have a lower rate of chance, And again, these are such small differences that we need huge numbers to figure it out. But right now, all we can tell you is science always changes. And we all learned that during COVID, right? I mean, science constantly changes. And so right now, you're right. We both agree that it appears it should be indefinitely. Maybe 10 years from now, we may have studies that show it's not, and we'll find out then. So, and then one more question I'll throw out, and then we're probably going to wrap this up, and I'll let you wrap this up after saying afterwards. But it was just a question of how frequent do we discard embryos after they sign the agreement. So just so people understand what that means, you have embryos that are sometimes genetically normal. You have some that are abnormal. So people will discard the abnormal. Sometimes people are done having kids. They'll decide to discard their embryos. There are multiple ways to discard. You can discard, like ethically, we can discard them in a certain way. You can donate them to another couple. You can donate them to research. So that's what the question is asking. And simply, I think what they're asking is it done immediately? And I don't think we can answer that because technically all clinics do it different ways. I think the most important part is they do it when it's appropriate for them. That may not be that week. It could be a month from them because they want to make sure they do it correctly. Because if there's anything that would be horrible is throwing away an embryo that wasn't meant to be. So they want to have all their focus on that. So usually they're not juggling it while they're doing the other stuff that's going on. But I know you've been in labs before. Is that about the same thing you see, that usually it's not right at that moment, but maybe all done around the same time to be able to put a lot of focus on it?
That's exactly right. And then there's a system of double and triple checking. Very extensive systems are in place for safety to make sure that, you know, the wrong eggs or embryos or whatever is asked to be discarded isn't inadvertently discarded. And there are different systems around this. I mean, some people will, keep many frozen embryos that are genetically abnormal. Other clinics and labs will, tell in their paperwork that, genetically abnormal embryos will be discarded. So these are very fair differences. It's just more a process and flow. I think one thing that's really important to also just throw out there with this question is that, embryos are treated as your property under these terms. And so you can do with them as you wish as the patient. And one thing that a clinic will never do is grow them out, right? It's not, they're frozen at a stage and they will never be grown out beyond that stage.
Correct. Like research is what he's talking about, is that,
Right.
They'll research how maybe a new media works, how it thaws better, a new technique, and then right away at that point it's discarded. Nothing is grown out to make something to be living at some point or be born.
Right.
Perfect.
Yeah,
well, I said, let you kind of fish things up here.
No, I mean, this was a pleasure. This was so much fun. This is a topic that you and I have been throwing around for quite some time that we were hoping to get a chance to talk about. It's a very hot topic because it's really a part of our field that's booming. And I'm glad that we had a chance to talk about it in a very candid way. I hope people out there can see that this needs to be like a measured approach, and it needs to be very much of a fit, a conversation that's within your family building goals and your future. And I think, I just encourage all the people out there that are considering doing this to really ask the hard questions to their REIs, to their fertility doctors, to make sure that they're getting out of it what they want. And I really appreciate your perspectives on this, Dr. Amols, and everybody who came on today. We really thank you.
I know we're stopping, and I feel bad making us go a minute longer here, but I just thought of a question. I definitely think it'd be really cool to end on here, and that is, someone's wanting to go freeze their eggs. There is no CDC data about egg freezing, the quality of clinics. How does someone pick the right clinic? What is something that you would maybe recommend? I know things I've thought of before, but I mean, in reality, right, it's pretty hard to know how well clinics are doing if there's no CDC data on it. And so what would you tell someone? I can tell what I would think. And we've talked about this before. I just wonder, what would you tell someone to look for when they're looking for a clinic?
Yeah, I think that you can still use the CDC data a little bit to just get a sense of, hey, how good is this clinic's lab? Because that tells you a lot, because IVF is a lot harder than egg freezing, right? So from a technical standpoint, the IVF process is much more sensitive than the egg freezing process. So usually places that are good at IVF are very good at egg freezing, and vice versa. But meaning if they're bad at IVF, they're probably not going to be very good at egg freezing. I think the other part of it is making sure that the clinic and the doctor are a good fit. You have very different needs as a patient who's going through the egg freezing process. And you just want to make sure it's a good fit. And so sometimes it's fair to set up an appointment, talk with your doctor, and check out another clinic. And I encourage everybody out there to do that, because I think sometimes you'll get a much better feel for where you belong, what's a better fit. But that's my 2 cents. I don't know. What about you?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think clinics that have, when I say good pregnancy rates, like in the upper echelon, they're one of the top clinics, I think you can make a pretty fair guess that they're going to be decent at the egg freezing as well. Because you're right, it's just one portion of it. But and some of the difference between clinics have really shrunk now that we have protocols that pretty much everyone's using, very similar protocols. Whereas in the past, there were some protocol differences. I mean, there's no question freezing a egg 6 hours after taking out versus 2 to 3 hours can make a difference in the success rate of that egg. So there are definitely changes. I've told people, and again, I don't know if I'm wrong by telling them this, but I feel like if a place has their own egg bank, right, I think they got to be pretty good at it, right? Because it's pretty hard to sell eggs to other people if you can't even thaw them that well, right? So if everyone's losing half their eggs, you go, well, they're not good at this. So I feel like that's something I've always felt is something to look at. And then I think even donors, I think that's another one where, they're thawing eggs. But I've always thought of that. I feel like how do you define it? But I think that's a fair thing you said. I think there's enough consolidation now in the way we thaw eggs that I think you're right. You could probably use that. Whereas back in the past, I mean, you couldn't. Everyone was thawing slightly different than how they were freezing eggs, and I think there's a little bit more consolidation in that area. So, anyways, sorry to keep us longer there. I just it was a question I was thinking in my head, going, that's probably some people are wondering is how do I pick the clinic? How do I know Bob's egg freezing is not going to be just as good as like NDFC or something like that? So,
no, that's a great question.
Well, perfect. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed it, and I know we always have fun doing this. We are both going to actually be at a meeting about 2 weeks from now. So we may skip the next 2 weeks. We may do one live at the actual conference where we can have other doctors there. But either way, we appreciate everyone coming, and please tell people about us, and hopefully you like this, and we look forward to doing more of these.
Yeah. Great seeing you all tonight.
See you later.
Bye-bye.